Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome back to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. Well, last month I announced that July would be all about Eve, which celebrates its 70th birthday this year. Unfortunately, the guest who I wanted to interview was not available, so we're going to shelve the Eve commemoration for later this year, which is when its actual anniversary occurs anyway. So instead, I've got a real treat for you. This month, we're going to honor the 80th anniversary of one of the very best screwball comedies ever made. It's Howard Hawks' His Girl Friday. And who better to discuss the fast-talking screwball with me than renowned feminist film critic Molly Haskell, author of the groundbreaking book From Reverence to Rape, The Treatment of Women in the Movies, and a regular contributor over the years to the Criterion Collection and Turner Classic Movies. Molly and I will explore why His Girl Friday is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. And rest assured that we won't talk 500 miles per hour like the characters in this flick do. For the full scoop on this month's motion picture, let's turn to Wikipedia for some needed context. How about? So, His Girl Friday is a 1940 American screwball comedy drama romance film directed by Howard Hawks and starring Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. It was released by Columbia Pictures. The plot centers on a newspaper editor named Walter Burns who's about to lose his ace reporter and ex-wife, Hildy Johnson, newly engaged to another man. Burns suggests that they cover one more story together, getting themselves entangled in the case of murderer Earl Williams as Burns desperately tries to win back his wife. The screenplay was adapted from the 1928 play The Front Page by Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur. This was the second time the play had been adapted for the screen, the first occasion being the 1931 film also called The Front Page. Now, the script for His Girl Friday was written by Charles Lederer and Ben Hecht, who's not credited for his contributions, unfortunately. The major change in this version, introduced by Hawks, is that the role of Hildy Johnson is a woman. Filming began in September 1939 and finished in November, 7 days behind schedule. Production was delayed because the frequent improvisation and numerous ensemble scenes required many retakes. Surprise, surprise. Hawks encouraged his actors to be aggressive and spontaneous, creating several moments in which the characters break the fourth wall. His Girl Friday has been noted for its surprises, comedy, and rapid overlapping dialogue. Hawks himself was determined to break the record for the fastest film dialogue, at the time held by The Front Page. His Girl Friday was originally released in January of 1940, so technically we're a few months late with the birthday festivities, but hey, better late than never, right? It ranks as number 19 on the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Laughs list of the greatest comedies and was selected in 1993 for preservation in the United States National Film Registry of the Library of Congress as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The movie's in the public domain, actually, because the copyright was not renewed. His Girl Friday currently earns a near-perfect 98% Rotten Tomatoes score, where it also earns an average critical score of 9.07 out of 10. You've heard it said that a picture's worth 1,000 words, but so's an original trailer, so here goes.
From the Columbia Studios in Hollywood comes an exciting new film triumph. A companion hit to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, His Girl Friday. Co-starring a thrilling new pair of screen lovers, devil-may-care Cary Grant and ravishing Rosalind Russell. Let's listen in to one of their tender, idyllic love scenes.
I am fond of you, you know.
And a girl?
I often wish you weren't such a stinker.
Hey, watch where you're aiming, will ya?
Lock the gate! He tried the gate!
Who got away? Who was it? Who did
Thanks, Earl Williams just escaped.
Jailbreak. Don't know yet. Call you back.
Hello, Operator Hildy Johnson. Will you get me...
Drop that phone.
Never mind. Put that gun down, Earl.
No, I won't. Here's your reprieve.
Huh?
They tried to bribe me right away.
Who are they? Who are they?
Them.
Why, that's absurd on the face of it. Walter, he's talking like a child.
Out of the mouths of babes.
Hi, babe.
This is Mrs. Baldwin, Bruce's mother.
What are you doing?
Shut up.
I won't shut up. You're doing something wrong.
Mother,
Take
please.
her out of here.
Now, wait a minute, Walter.
Quiet, Louis.
Yes, boss.
Take the lady over to Pollock Mike's.
My name's Louis Peluso.
Take all those Miss America pictures off, face
Hildy, tell me. Please tell me the truth. Hildy, if you ever love me, please
Now
tell
look
me.
here, my good
You
fellow.
shut up, Burns.
How can I do anything?
You're doing all this to her. I know that. She wanted to get away from you and everything you stand for, but you were too smart. You caught her and changed her mind, didn't you?
Take Hitler and stick him on the funny page. Now let me answer you.
Okay, before I introduce my guest, it's my duty to remind you that, as is true every month, the conversation you're about to hear is spoiler-tastic. So if you're listening to this without the benefit of having screened His Girl Friday, don't make me turn this car around. Get thee to YouTube or Amazon Prime and watch the movie. All set? Then I'm thrilled to roll out the red carpet for my guest, former film critic for The Village Voice, New York Magazine, Vogue, and other prestigious publications, previous co-host of The Essentials on TCM, esteemed film professor, spouse to the late film critic Andrew Sarris, and author of several books on the cinema, most recently Steven Spielberg, A Life in Films, the one, the only, Molly Haskell. Molly, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and I'm so delighted to now know about your podcast because I don't know how I hadn't come across it before, but it's now my absolute favorite, and I'm afraid it's just going to take all of my time to get through all the ones you've already done. But
It's very sweet. Thank you.
Me.
Glad you're enjoying it. Thank you for the kind words. When did you first see His Girl Friday, and tell us why this film is important to you, Molly?
I cannot remember when I first saw it, but I'm just trying to remember and sort of look up and refresh my memory. I think it was first of all, the French were the ones who really saw Hawk's body of work before Americans did, because for various reasons of distribution and how we're using certain films were released and certain weren't, and they were watching them. And in fact, I was watching this documentary the other night on TCM where Bertrand Tavernier, it's a documentary he made about his love of French film, which had been in the film festival. And he talks about Jacques Becker, who was so influenced. He was directing films, in the 40s and 50s and I don't think late 30s, and how influenced he was by Hawks. And Jacques Rivette wrote about that influence, and he sort of was showing that how in the films of Becker there was that kind of medium-length shot that he used, as sort of the same kind of dynamic group portrayals and things like that. So that was interesting. And then Andrew Sarris and Peter Bogdanovich sort of took up the causes with the politique des auteurs, having read Cahiers du Cinema and been very influenced by the French point of view. Mm-hmm. So I think I wasn't in New York at this point, and then when I did come, I wasn't kind of in the film world for a while, so this sort of predates my Hawks enthusiasm. But there were retrospectives at MoMA, and I think Dan Talbot, I asked Toby, his widow, if she remembers them showing His Girl Friday at the New Yorker Theater, which Dan founded in like 1960. And she said she's sure it was there. She just can't remember when. And Peter and Andrew were doing a lot of programming for Dan at that theater. So I think it was around the 60s. But I think, in a way, the screwball comedies were a little later becoming fashionable for whatever reason. I taught them, but that was sort of later in the 80s and 90s in my film class. Mm-hmm. But I think it was certainly the late 60s because Peter Bogdanovich made What's Up, Doc? In 1972, and the critics got the references to Bringing Up Baby. Mm-hmm. So by that time, they were in sort of general or at least film specialist circulation. I don't remember if I was blown away by it. I think I'm more blown away by it now than I was then. Mm. And I think it's sort of a miracle of sorts. It's this kind of perpetual motion machine that just
Yes.
never stops. And
Oh, that's so
sort of
well
leaves
put.
you breathless. And there's been nothing like it. I was doing a talk on it last summer at a benefit for this, they're building this new theater, and they showed His Girl Friday, and I spoke about it. And before the thing, this young woman from the local paper called up, and she said, well, is it relatable? And I thought, well, I just don't know. Why don't you try relating to it instead of making it relate to you? So that's my attitude.
That's a great
about
answer.
The trouble is the present is so different from the past, and it's terrifying, the pace of change we've been through. So it's very hard for the past, I think, to teach us anything really in some ways, just because things have changed so fast and the world is kind of upside down. But
Yeah.
I think in a way it's more important. I just feel it's more important than ever for people to see where we've come from in order to understand why we made the mistakes which they now see as sort of unforgivable, but what the context was. And for instance, just simply the roles of women have expanded so rapidly since then. But I mean, I think all the screwball comedies were one of women's best genres because they allowed them, because it was taught. I think it was Andrew that called the screwball comedy the sex comedy without sex. Because by this time the production code had become very rigid, and you couldn't, you really couldn't show anything. So what did you? So you had talk instead of sex, and talk is the eros. I mean, just as violence is the eros of a Marty Scorsese film, so talk is the eros. The back and forthness, the battlefield, the battle of the sexes, that's the eros, and it's also what you feel as the connection of this couple. I mean, this rapid fire talk between them. And to go back a little bit, it comes from, of course, The Front Page. The Front Page was a play by Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur that played on Broadway in 1928, and then a film was made of that in 1931. This was actually before the production code had become so rigid. I mean, there was still a little bit of censorship, but it was basically a racy time, and it was also that movies had become sound films. So they were hungry for talking scripts and for plays, a lot of Broadway plays. And the newspaper world was full of sort of savvy, racy, fast-talking people. So it was a natural. So that was made into the film, quite a good film in 1931. By the time Hawks did it in 1940, he had this genius idea of, because it's really a buddy film, the ruthless editor and his star reporter, and they were both male in all the earlier versions. The editor, of course, is trying to keep the reporter from going off and getting married, and he will use the most underhanded means necessary. So, I mean, the story went that Hawks had a secretary or a woman friend or somebody read, just he was going over the script and read it, and he's just, eureka, let's make it a female. But no one's ever come forth to sort of to verify the story.
Right.
I think it was just something Hawks would have done. It was, I mean, he had done Only Angels Have Wings, and all of his films are kind of romance, what we now call romance, these really intense buddy stories. So he understood it was a love story. It was a triangle between the editor, the reporter, and the fiance. So he had this brilliant idea of adapting it that way, and that's how it sort of all came into being.
Wow, you gave me the 800-foot view from atop, which I really appreciate. You provided some good kind of pretext and context to a lot of the questions I'd like to get into with you. So why is this movie worth celebrating all these years later, Molly? Why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time?
First of all, it's charting, I think, women, whether it's screwball comedy or whatever the genre, you can always see a theme, or often, if there are films with men and women in them, of women sort of trying to find their place in the world. Where do I belong in a man's world, which is what it was, and still is to some extent, but basically was almost exclusively a man's world in the 30s and 40s when these films were being made. And since there wasn't a profession open, and this doesn't apply to His Girl Friday, that's what's unique about it. But generally speaking, in the screwball comedy, there wasn't a profession open, but how the woman declared herself, how she had her so-called agency, was in the dialogue, where she gave as good as she got to the man. And that was sort of expressive of a certain equality that was aimed for in the screwball comedy. And that was what was sort of exciting and exhilarating about them, that the women gave as good as they got. And even physically, in something like 20th century, Carol Lombard is physical with John Barrymore. So you have this battle of wits where you feel it's quite equal. Of course, in a way, His Girl Friday, the male is not. It's a real, sort of male's supreme male, sort of trying to dominate the woman. It's not quite the same as, say, The Awful Truth, where you really do feel a real equilibrium. Of course,
That's right.
there too, you have the man who's the philanderer, and the woman can't be a philanderer like a man can be. So, but in a sense, it comes out in some kind of equilibrium. But with this, you've got a newspaper woman, which, I mean, there were a few women playing newspaper women, and there were real life. In fact, this is her dress in this, that wonderful hat and the striped suit that Rosalind Russell wears is supposedly based on Adela Rogers St. John's. It was a well-known reporter at the time.
Is that right?
Yeah, and Luella Parsons. There were women reporters. Sure. And so she has this kind of swagger. She's actually the star reporter, and everybody acknowledges this. All the other reporters acknowledge it. So, I mean, she really is on a kind of pedestal there, which is quite unusual. And I think it's just one of the films that, in line of the evolving roles of women that we see in movies, and in both explicit and implicit ways.
Yeah, I want to get into that with you more in a further question. I think it still matters, in addition to all the things you said, because it's one of the finest and most representational screwball comedies, which we've already kind of talked about.
Exactly. And there's nothing like it, you know, when it came out. I mean, the front page is also a fairly fast talking, but it's like a silent film compared to His Girl Friday.
Right.
It's funny because Pauline Kael attributed it to Hector MacArthur, the dialogue, but it's really Hawks who did this thing of having, instead of a covering, he had multiple microphones all over the set.
That's right.
And he encouraged the actors to step on each other's lines, and he dispensed with the boom, so that you had all these multiple microphones to get greater clarity from all the different people. But for technical reasons, the mics couldn't operate simultaneously, so you had the sound engineer frantically switching from one to the other.
Back and forth, right?
Yeah.
It's nuts.
And then at some point, Rosalind Russell resented that she thought Cary Grant had so many more and better lines than she did, so she got her brother-in-law, who was in advertising or something, to make up some lines for her.
Yeah, I read that.
So,
yes.
and do feel this, that they have sort of equal time and equal wit. I mean, nobody in film talks that fast today, or that much. You just don't have it. So that's what's absolutely unique in this film, even in comparison with the other screwball comedies. That's what's exciting and breathless, and it's this kind of, the relentlessness kind of sweeps you up in it, and you just don't, you can't even question all the sort of amoral. I mean, it's totally amoral. It's sort of a Valentine to the newspaper. This is in Hector MacArthur's man, who both worked as newspapermen in Chicago, so they knew this sort of world of yellow journalism, which it was sort of fake news, avant-la-lettre. So it was a kind of both a Valentine to the newspaper world and a kind of morality play of the horrors of it. I mean, it's a moral swamp they're living in, and they're sort of cheerfully bigoted and racist and sexist and
all the
so
above.
I think a lot of that people would sort of shudder. I think they do probably shudder at some of it, and they refer to Earl Williams, the anarchist, who's running from the law. He's this sort of pathetic, sweet little true believer, not communist, but anarchist, he insists. But he's shot what they call a colored man, and then all the politicians get in on the act. So one of the things about the abundance and speed of the dialogue is they just talk so fast because they don't dare stop and think about what they're doing, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And the viewer sometimes doesn't have a chance to catch up and think much.
Exactly.
You just got to take it.
I mean, Cary Grant, when you look at that performance, you just can't quite believe it. I mean, you know, they've made all these other versions. I mean, of course, was Billy Wilder did one with men with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon.
Yes.
And then I just noticed there was this one, oh God, I can't remember the name of it now. I've written it down, but I just happened on it the other night with Kathleen Turner and Burt
Switching
Reynolds.
Channels.
Switching Channels, yeah.
That's actually kind of a loose remake of this movie. This story has been filmed at least really 4 times.
Yeah, it is, and it's never worked very well. Well, I was reading about Switching Channels, and apparently this would make a good movie. That Kathleen Turner and Burt Reynolds apparently hated each other. He couldn't stand the role. I mean, he felt that it was her movie in a way, so he was resenting, which is interesting that he felt that. But
they could make a movie really just on how much they hated each other.
Exactly, that would be really interesting because there's a lot of that in there. You know, that animus should be there. I mean, that's a big part of it.
Sure.
But what's so great in His Girl Friday is he's just being ungallant with a vengeance. You know, he doesn't pull a chair out for her. He goes
Nope.
out of the door first, and he just.
It's
Yeah,
funny. It's funny, but in real life, you kind of whoa. If you saw somebody doing that, you might do a double take.
Exactly,
there.
but
you
this
can't
is
take it
what's
seriously. This is screwball comedy territory.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. You know that he's putting on an act. I mean, he's doing this deliberately.
Yeah.
In a way. I mean, it's really about he's competing for her. So, I mean, he probably loves her, but it's really the blood of the competitive sport there to get her away from Ralph Bellamy. So everything that Bellamy does, he's just doing the opposite.
Right.
But
and you know by the end that he's ultimately, his ulterior motive is to win her back. I mean, he does love her. He wants her back. It's just that he's not the kind of guy who's ever going to say those words, I love you.
No, he's never going to say it. But it's all there. It's hilariously funny, but there's also something underlying very moving about it. Is when they the three of them go to lunch, to that early scene.
Mm-hmm.
And he's making all these horrible remarks, and she's calling him a snake. But every time he says something demeaning or outrageous, you can tell she enjoys it. I mean, they enjoy it when each other gets the best of each other.
They're made for each other.
I mean, she enjoys it when he gets the best of her in a way, and he enjoys it when she gets the best of him.
I think this movie really still matters because it could be the fastest spoken film ever made. Now, we've already kind of touched on this, and I'd like to dovetail back to it in the next question, too. But Hawks, he was actually trying to break the record at the time for the speediest dialogue ever filmed. So even if that's a gimmick, it's just a fascinating gimmick. We talked about some of the remakes. There was the 31 original, based on the 28 stage play, but then there was this film. And then there was a remake in 1974, and then we talked about switching channels in 88. So my point here is that this is not only the finest version of this story adapted to the big screen, but I think it's one of the very best remakes of all time. When you think about remakes, I mean, Hollywood is bankrupt of ideas today. It's remake city. But is there a more exemplary remake than His Girl Friday?
No, I can't think of one. When we get off, I'm going to try to think of one, but I don't think so.
We talked about Cary Grant. I think this is his very finest performance. Such an underrated actor. I don't think he ever won an Oscar. Not that really matters, but you think of all the great roles he has played and so many screwball comedies in which it's very hard for me anyway to pick a favorite of his roles. They're all so great. But I think this movie features, debatably, the finest performances in both the careers of Grant and Rosalind Russell. I mean, their comedic timing, their cadence, physical gesticulations, their sheer ability to deliver lines at a practically impossible pace, the blocking, the choreography. I mean, the collaboration with Hawks in terms of being able to frame everybody the right way in the scene, that takes real talent. And there's so much going on here behind the scenes. You could tell there's so much planning, even though there is an improvisational spirit and an ad-libbing going on to some extent. You could tell that a movie like this really takes a lot of careful strategy. And I think Grant and Rosalind are so up to that challenge. They acquit themselves so nicely in this movie.
I absolutely agree. I can't imagine anyone else in those roles, and I think it is the crowning achievement of both of us. I mean, of course, it's a little bit easier Russell didn't have as many out-and-out triumphs as Grant did.
True.
So it's a little harder with Grant, but yeah, to me, I mean, it's like opera. It's like a sports event.
Mm-hmm.
It's so many different things, and despite the speed of the dialogue and the multiple voices, it's always clear. I mean, basically know what's going on when you need to know what's going on.
Right.
And it just sort of sweeps you up, and it's relentless. And people used to. A little bit, I remember when we saw it, maybe when I was showing it, second wave feminism, and we like endings in which women capitulated in the end and all. But I think the ending now, I find it's first of all, it's interesting when I showed this film. It was mostly an older crowd, and some of them may have seen it before, and some of them hadn't, and they were just stunned at everything about it. It's like you're on this merry-go-round, and finally you just have to collapse. I mean, that's all it is. It's just. She's been tossed this way and that way. She's been of two minds the whole way. She's been torn between these two men, and finally she knows where she's going, and she just sort of collapses. And we all do. We just have to catch our breath.
Right.
And one of the things one person said, I guess we were talking about, can you imagine it with anyone else in those roles? And of course, nobody could imagine it. I mean, only Cary Grant could get away with that, the things that he says.
Right.
And it's only because it's in a deliberately exaggerated performance, as we sort of suggested. His eyeballs are popping, And she just said, at one point, she says, so you'd stop acting or something. So quite consciously putting on a performance for her. So I think you sort of, we accept it on that level, and you just know nobody else could get away with it. Somebody suggested, what about Carol Lombard in Rosalind Russell's role? And I hadn't thought it out at that point, but I guess they thought, well, maybe she's a little sexier. But I just can't imagine anyone but Rosalind Russell. Somebody said, well, how did she get away with being that strong and that, practically as equal and even better than the other news? How did she get away with it? How did she not have to pay for that? Thinking about it, I think it's because she brings this womanly quality to it. I mean, she's just an ace reporter, the best writer, but also she has this humanity. I mean, her humanity towards Molly Malloy and Earl. I mean, the others are just so cynical about that. They just almost can't wait for the execution. And she just has this kind of this empathy. And I think it's what modulates the whole movie. I mean, there's this kind of soul. She has a soul at the core of it,
right,
which you don't have. I think it's one of the reasons this is better than all the other versions, because she brings something to it that nobody brings in the other versions. And that it was a genius of Hawks to see this and to let this happen, because basically he's interested in the work world, and it's usually a man's world with him. And there are always really interesting women in it, but basically it's a man's world. And he allows her to impinge on this man's world. I mean, usually she has to be a little bit of a man, which is why we love the Hawks female protagonists and heroines, is because there's an androgynous quality. He says at some point, "Oh, I hired you because you flashed those goo-goo eyes at me," implying that maybe she not slept with him, but flirted with him for the job. But I see her as more in the tradition of Hawks women like Katharine Hepburn in Bringing Up Baby and Paula Prentice in Man's Favorite Sport, as a kind of awkward woman who's been maybe a tomboy, and maybe she's taller than all the guys. She's being awkward and taller than the men that she would go out with, and even a little bit nerdy. So, and you see that when she rushes out. I mean, all of them are living for the sound of the siren, right? I mean, it's just the call of the crime. And she goes rushing out, and she tries to hold her hat on her head, and she's got that sleek suit on, and she's running with heels, and it's just this wonderfully awkward, propulsive moment, and falls. It's a very physical performance.
But she proves that she's a determined and skilled female who can defy those expectations of what? I mean, this time women are expected to get married at a young age, have children, tend the house, cook the meals, put career aspirations on hold in deference to patriarchal pressures, right? So here you have such a fascinating, different kind of character. And even in a profession, as you said, dominated by men, are there any other ways that this character, Hildy Johnson, is so important in cinema up to this point, especially compared to typical female characters in Hollywood films of this time, Molly?
Well, yeah, with all the reasons I've said. And also what you said is, but also you have here that option. That's what she thinks she wants. She's been programmed, like all of us were, to get married and settle down and have children, and that's what she thinks she wants. Isn't that what we all want? So that's what she comes in with Bruce, and poor Ralph Bellamy is just wonderful in this role. And
so
he seems like the perfect, he's courtly and he wears his rubbers, and that's what she thinks she wants. She wants to settle down in the suburbs with a little White House and picket fence. And then she has to, Stanley Cavell in the comedies of Remarriage, which is really what one of which this is, talks about the woman's transformation. But to me, it's not so much that as allowing one side of her to emerge and the other to recede, because she's ambivalent. I mean, she thinks she wants the proper woman's domestic life, of marriage and domesticity, and yet she loves, the way she responds to the emergency. It shows that that's what she really is. She's the best newspaper man. So you see her actually, through the catalyst of Grant, choosing work of the conventional home life.
Absolutely. I want to go back for a moment here. In what ways do you think His Girl Friday was influential on cinema and popular culture, for that matter, or set trends in any way? So we talked about, of course, the speedy dialogue and the overlapping dialogue. They're often speaking at a frenetic pace. Two or more characters, talk simultaneously. And I think that this forces the viewer to try to keep up with what is said and helps to cram in a lot of jokes and content in a short amount of time. And to me, anyway, that makes the film more rewarding on repeat viewings. What do you think here?
Yeah, I agree. I think because you catch more each time, and you sort of appreciate the framing and the way people interact within the frames, and the different and all the character roles are so much fun, and you have time to sort of get to know them. And I mean, you feel at the end of it, I think the way she feels, you sort of out of breath. I don't know about the influence. I haven't thought about that. It's almost inimitable. It seems to me, since people have tried to imitate it and have failed. I guess eventually the talk was no longer the same. I mean, if you look at all the great or not so great romantic comedies that have come along since then, I can't think of any that are like that. And especially the sort of recent ones are not all that verbal. They're sort of goofy and they're behavioral. That's a whole different thing. And I was thinking about, we appreciate it also because we haven't seen it anywhere else. It hasn't been duplicated anywhere.
Let me give some ammunition here to some evidence I uncovered. Reportedly, the average word per minute pace in this movie is 240 words a minute. Now, I found that the typical speed is approximately 140 words per minute in a normal conversation. But in watching the bonus features on the Criterion edition of this film, David Bordwell, he said that he and his folks did their own research, and at some points it goes up to 300 words per minute, a typical rate in this movie. So, I mean, it even surpasses what they thought. So they're going more than twice the speed at some points. And it makes sense. It's so fast. I have to turn on the subtitles just to appreciate it. Yeah. This time around, I'm so glad the subtitles were there. Consider that the final screenplay, it tallied 191 pages, and usually each page of a screenplay equates to about 60 to 90 seconds of screen time. But then you think, well, this movie's runtime is only 92 minutes, and what does that tell you? Hawks is going for the world record here. So, and you talked about already, this time they're relying on a single boom, so the sound technician, they were more innovative in terms of using multiple mics and having to turn them on and off. We talked about how Hawks allowed his actors to use ad-libbing and improvisation to generate more realistic discourse. So those are all kind of adding up to some innovation here. But did it parlay into any other films that took the lead of his Girl Friday?
One just struck me, and it's always getting credit for this pioneering thing, but he isn't. It's Altman. I mean, Altman used overlapping dialogue and multiple mics, having people interrupt each other and all that. He did it for a slightly different end, which was not clarity. He wanted to sort of obscure and have people to step on each other. I mean, Hawks does this. He has people step on each other, but you still hear what they say. Whereas Altman deliberately kind of fudgy. He wants it a little bit fudgy, but it's still the same principle. And somehow, you never hear Hawks' name mentioned when people talk about Altman and the overlapping dialogue. Or somebody like Renoir also has that. They love this thing, the realism of the sense of people. I mean, I don't think that people actually do that much in conversation, but they think that there's something more real about it, and maybe this feels less scripted.
Yeah.
When you have people doing that.
When you have a 90 or so minute movie in the golden age of Hollywood that needs to be made, I mean, you're going to have overlapping dialogue if you want to cram all this in. But I agree, in real life, it may not be that realistic. Hawks said, well, listen to people at a cocktail party sometime. They do it all the time. I agree with you. It may not be that plausible, but I totally buy it for this movie.
That's really interesting because you realize it's convention. All these things are conventions. And this was a convention there. And you have this compression. And this is what distinguishes it, I think, from modern romantic comedy, which are the opposites, where everything is kind of elongated and stretched out. Yeah. And it has much more of a kind of ad-libby feel. There's a kind of shaggy dog rhythm. You feel like they don't have any time limits. I mean, some of them are actually not that long, but they feel long just because the rhythm is so slow. And you don't have sort of punchlines and things like that. It's anti that kind of those kinds of conventions.
Right. Okay, a few more innovations before we go to the next question here. So this would have been, of course, a groundbreaking portrayal of a smart, autonomous, resourceful, strong-willed female lead. It would have been, kind of groundbreaking in terms of the gender politics and the bending of that. This helped solidify the newspaper story subgenre, I would argue. It's still cited today. Some people list it as their favorite newspaper movie. And it's one that, upon its release, supposedly inspired many to pursue a career in the press. You often hear, after people watched All the President's Men, there was suddenly a flurry of prospects rushing to join the newsroom, so to speak. Well, I guess that happened after this movie, from what I read. And you also, Molly, you got to ponder the many films about the newspaper business that immediately followed in His Girl Friday's wake. So let's rattle them off. Foreign Correspondent, same year. And again, these are all after the release date of His Girl Friday. Foreign Correspondent, The Philadelphia Story, Citizen Kane, Meet John Doe, and Penny Serenade. And that's just a handful of examples, but I think there is a little interesting trend that this kind of jump-started. My last point here is that it's also an early example of a meta movie. I'm sure you've heard of this, right? It's a movie that kind of slyly comments on the motion picture biz by providing amusing references. So what are the references here? Of course, Archie Leach, Grant's real name he gives, and Ralph Bellamy. And the joke there is that he plays Bruce, and he also portrayed a similar third-wheel suitor in The Awful Truth 3 years earlier. I just love Ralph Bellamy in this role. But yes, it's a meta movie, kind of before there were meta movies. I can't think of many earlier examples of that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And that the idea of Cary Grant commenting on his own persona and his own origins is just fantastic, yeah.
So I want to ask you, Molly, what is the moral of the story? Are there any themes or messages of note that are explored in His Girl Friday?
Well, I think Hawks always is interested in men, and I think men in a general way, human beings, but men at work. Mm-hmm. Work is the way people express themselves. Work is what they do. Work is just the élan vital of their lives. And for a woman to also be allowed to have this as the center of her life is sort of revolutionary in a way. It just wasn't happening. And the morality is questionable. And it's sort of funny that the idea that people would have decided to become newspapermen because of this, because the portrait of newspapermen is certainly checkered. It's not exactly, it's not all the president's men, not heroic at all.
Right.
And it's anti-heroic. And that's, I think, here's one of the things I think is important about this and the screwball comedies and the lack of sentimentality, particularly in
Yes.
Hawks. I think the other side of that is a kind of cruelty. I mean, there's a kind of elitism in Grant and Russell persona, as there is in all of them. I mean, most of the screwball couples, they don't have children. They have money. They live in this rarefied world. They're not encumbered in the way that some people might be. So there is a kind of elitism. I think another funny thing here, which is that it's so condescending and even ridiculing of the suburbs, and of course of the people like Ralph Bellamy. It's not that these are the people that are going to movies, So it's their audience that they're dissing, and
that's true.
That this idea there is a hierarchy, and Grant and Russell are funnier and cooler and more interesting and exciting than the people beneath them. But there's also a sense that these newspaper men are kind of not moral cripples exactly, but certainly they have blunted ethics, so they're not heroic in that sense. I don't know if you saw My Name is Dolomite.
No, I didn't.
Eddie
it's
Murphy.
On my Netflix
Yeah,
list.
It's really fun. And Eddie Murphy plays this comedian who's coming into his own in California in the 70s. And at one point, he goes into the theater where the front page is playing the Billy Wilder version.
Okay.
And he's sitting there with all this white art, and all the audience, which is all whites, are laughing hysterically, and he's sitting there looking. He doesn't get it at all. So, so that there really is a time-bound, class-bound element to the movie.
Sure.
Again, when you look at these recent, say the comedies of Lynn Shelton, which I like a lot, or I was just looking at this new one, Palm Springs, which is a sort of Groundhog Day revisited, but they're all they have this sort of shambolic quality, as I suggested earlier. And here too, the couples are of an elite of their own, but this time it's mostly because it's not that they're brighter and shinier than everybody else, but they're not pompous and conventional. They're kind of a little bit eccentric and goofy. That's the new sex appeal. I mean, you have it in people like Seth Rogen and Mark Duplass, attractive women, and the attractive women go for sort of the funny, goofy guy. It's a whole different kind of sex appeal thing. But I think with His Girl Friday, what you feel is the conversation is the erotic anchor of the relationship, and that the worst thing for a marriage is not infidelity but boredom, and they're just never going to be bored.
Yes, no question about it.
Because all the romantic comedies and screwballs are not asking not only are you the right person for me, and what is my life going to be with you, but it's what is my life going to be with you? Is marriage worth it? They're almost asking that question, all of them. I think that's sort of true of the comedies before and now. And who am I in this relationship? And I think that's particularly always been true of women because men sort of knew who they were and they didn't it wasn't problematic, whereas women it was.
Great thoughts. I racked my brain in answer to this question, trying to think of themes or messages or morals to the story, because how seriously can you take a movie like His Girl Friday? So I think the main message, it's hard to argue here, is you need to stay true to yourself and your talents. We see how, by the denouement, that Hildy is relieved that she's reunited with Walter. She's going to continue as an in-demand journalist, and she's avoided the temptation to settle down and live a life of likely, spousal subservience in the burbs with someone who's not her intellectual and emotional equal. So you got to stay true to yourself and your talents.
I think it's not so much true to self because that self has been divided. It's a divided self.
Okay.
It's a woman who grows up. I mean, it's still the same theme, I think. It's still the same. It's your finer self, your most creative self that you want to, that you come into, you accept, you commit to. The two sides are there, and that's what makes it so tough. And that's what's the whole tension in the film is not just Earl Williams and all of that. It's a tension in Hildy. And I think this is really the story of all the screwball comedies. And if you want to call it a moral, that's fine. I mean, I think the morality is implicit as opposed to films that win Academy Awards. I mean, all these, there was, I think about the same time you had The Lady Eve and Shop Around the Corner, three of the greatest screwball comedies. I don't know, Shop is maybe romantic comedy, but of all time, and not a single Academy Award. I think there was one nomination among them for story in The Lady Eve. And Greer Garson movies and other things where the country was pulling together the war. Mm-hmm. And the comedy then and now it just was not taken seriously. And because you couldn't say, well, this is about something important, but it is about something important, as you and I have just discussed. But what a woman does in life was not considered as important as what a country does at the, in the time of war,
Sure.
But
right.
to me, it's just as important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another one I thought of is the importance of adapting to a chaotic and rapidly changing world. So we observe how Hildy rolls with the changes thrown at her, how she impressively multitasks and quickly pivots to situations as they abruptly shift, right? There's a value to thinking quickly on your feet, to talking faster than the other person, and to doing what it takes to get the story, as this intrepid female reporter does. So I think there's something to that message as well. And lastly, this is a little bit trite, but opposites don't attract after all could be a message of the movie. You often hear, opposites attract. Hildy and Bruce are kind and courteous to each other, but they just aren't cut from the same cloth. They aren't destined to make each other happy. Walter and Hildy, by contrast, they seem made for and deserving of each other.
Absolutely. I think that's right about adapting, and that's the whole thing about that. They really sort of light on their feet. They're incredibly flexible. They can turn on a dime. They're used to that. So it's a metabolism. The tempo of that newspaper world, and adapting to that. It's like it's a world unto itself. And it's almost if you can do that, you can do anything. But she needs that. I mean, she feeds. I think she feeds on that, and he does too. And I think she's probably always going to say, "Oh, why can't we have a real honeymoon?" And then every time they go on a honeymoon, there's going to be a fire or something,
or a scoop breaking, right?
A scoop, yeah. But no, it's really about the true self emerging, and what's more important than that?
Absolutely. How are we supposed to think and feel about Walter and Hildy? I lead a film discussion group in which we recently discussed this film, and some people have some problems with not only, their profession as it was in the day, but, I mean, are we supposed to root for these people? They seem like kind of despicable in many ways. So, especially considering their amorality and their yellow journalism tactics, even unlawful behavior, how are we supposed to think and feel about Walter and Hildy?
Well, I have a sort of theme now that I sort of tried out. I had to do a panel on Gone with the Wind because I'd written a book about it, Turner Classic Movies. I had a panel dealing with this was before the HBO kerfuffle, but it was dealing with the legacy of Gone with the Wind, and I was on there with Donald Bogle and two black women, terrific women, one a producer and one an academic, talking about the legacy, and we talked about all the horrors of it and so forth. Fiedler had said this too, that you can love something and hate it. He didn't use these words. It was like you can object to something on ideological grounds and still love it emotionally somehow. And my feeling, I said about Gone with the Wind, show it. And the whole idea when you say it's something relatable, how are people going to deal with it now, is the idea that they can't be made uncomfortable. Why not? Why can't we be uncomfortable? Why can't we look at this movie and see this is appalling? It's outrageous. It's totally morally and ethically questionable.
Mm-hmm.
But we can also understand the excitement of it, too. And you don't have to say you approve of yellow journalism. You don't approve of it, or the underhanded things they do, and still find the charm in it. Hawks and the people and directors who direct these films are walking a tightrope, but I think it's also, there's an element of cruelty in it, too, in this film. And not just to Ralph Bellamy and to all the boobs in the hinterlands, but to everybody under them. There's cruelty. But something about this, and there's something like that in Groundhog Day, too. And I think it cuts against the sentimentality of movies. And when you look, it's always the sentimental movies that don't really endure, and movies like this that have this darker side. And even the ending, which sort of leaves it, Hawks is never great with endings. He doesn't do happy endings. But the ambiguity at the end is part of the strength of the movie. You're of two minds, and it's all right to be uncomfortable. Drama is about conflict. It's about women who have fantasies that are not politically correct, and Gone with the Wind and in many other movies. And somehow today, I think young people want to erase the ambivalence. They don't want to have to feel ambivalent about anything. They don't want to be uncomfortable about anything. You can deplore something in a movie and also respond to it, either emotionally or intellectually in other ways. It's called ambivalence.
I love everything you just said. I completely agree with you. I think that in terms of how we're supposed to think or feel about Walter and Hildy, well, that's up to you, obviously. We're not trying to tell people how to think or feel, but I think that the bygone context helps here. We see that disclaimer at the start of the film that, this story occurred years ago, tries to briefly explain that this is how the journalism profession used to operate. Well, that's not letting everybody off the hook so easily. But, okay, so the filmmakers are covering their bases a little, wink, wink, right? But I believe we can abide by their behavior thanks to Hawks' unique style. You've already talked about this. So Hawks is known for often focusing on skilled professionals within an insular environment, experts who are, driven by a love of their work and a code of professionalism and camaraderie without being encumbered by sentimentality. There's that word again. But we are meant to believe that Hildy and Walter are the best at what they do, even if what they do is create sensationalistic journalism without ethics. And I think that there's something to be admired in that kind of talent, even though what they do is somewhat unforgivable.
You have to accept a certain degree of stylization in films. It's not reality. Newspaper men spend a lot of time hunched over typewriters, not talking at all. They don't race around and talk a mile a minute like that. There's a convention. It's hyperbolic in both the versions. So you have to accept that too, that it's exaggeration. They're not that unethical. They're not that fast. All of those things.
Right.
But that's also what makes it exciting. It's a kind of quintessence of a newspaper story, a love story.
Plus, they don't give you much time to really sit and think about the moral problems.
No, you're not
because
supposed
it's so
to.
fast.
Well, that's the way you figure that's what gets them through the day. They don't. The reason they're talking all the time so fast is because they can't stop and think about what they're doing, because they'd be so appalled if they,
And neither can we. So, despite the cramped milieu of basically, 3 or 4 main sets, Hawks, who's known for being a director of action pictures, right? He keeps things kinetic. He keeps things moving
it's
by
an action
having
picture. Right. It's an action
so he
picture.
has speedily spoken words and sudden dramatic and comedic twists function as the action elements in what would otherwise be an essentially prosaic filming of a stage play, right? So in other words, you think about the medium compositions, the masterful editing, the intense focus on verbiage. All these things help distract us from any moral dilemmas we may feel. And this is ultimately, I would argue, an action movie, only it uses words and abrupt plot twists instead of things like car chases, combat, explosions, to keep us riveted.
Yeah. The words are projectiles in a way. They have an active function. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask you, how can you persuade someone to watch this movie today, especially a younger viewer who has never seen it before? How can you convince them that it's worthwhile and relevant?
Well, I think for all the reasons I've already said about if you're going to track women, the various ways that women have progressed from the 30s and 40s to the present, if you're interested at all in that, and I think people should be, because I think I already said this, but I think it's important to see the past to see how far we've come or how far we have or haven't come. It's just necessary before you start criticizing the past for not being the present, for not having all the correct attitudes about everything, just see where they're coming from. And I mean, I just think to expand one's sort of moral and behavioral universe is important to see the films of the past, but I also understand that it may be too wide a gap. A lot of people that don't even want to deal with films of the past because it's just that past is, I mean, when I came along, there wasn't that much of a past, you know, there was fewer decades to even think about. Even silent cinema wasn't that far gone. But now there's so much. It's hard. And I'm not in constant touch with, I mean, I was doing this with David Schwartz, and he said, he was talking about how his students had real trouble with Godard. They found him extremely sexist, which he is probably. And I mean, I saw that even at the time, but I wasn't as struck by it then as I might be now. So I think there's some movies that can make the transition and some that just can't. And I think it's trial and error. Have you tried it? You said you have shown it and they had trouble with it, but did they have too much trouble with it, or were they able to appreciate it in spite of the...
Well, it helps that
objection?
my group skews a little bit older even than me, so of course they're more acclimated to older movies. But I'm curious about the shelf life of this movie. And you could ask this about any older Hollywood movie, a black and white movie from the 40s, for example. It's kind of the same question that applies. How can we get future generations to, take interest in them? Who's going to be watching His Girl Friday in 80 years? Now, we're not going to be around. I hope it's not just some museum curio for art students, film students, and people who go to MoMA. I hope that there's a Turner Classic Movies or something similar that's still around. But for the reasons you said, I think it's important to look at what the past can teach us, how women's roles have changed. And this movie can really teach us a lot about that. And in some ways, it's a rhetorical question. I don't know if it can be answered. We're not going to be here to answer it, but I am concerned in terms of the shelf life, the evergreen nature of some of these movies, because they deserve to be seen, even if they are problematic, even if they are dated morally, gender politics-wise, etc. I think that they really deserve a place in pop culture and the public consciousness, and they should not be forgotten about. We still listen to Beethoven symphonies, and those are several hundred years old. Why can't we be watching His Girl Friday?
Well, I agree. One of the reasons, in spite of the fact that film is taken seriously now and has been for quite a while as an art form, I think some people still don't take it that seriously. I mean, you talk about old films, you don't talk about old novels.
That's right.
Or old symphonies. You talk about Beethoven symphonies or Jane Austen's novels. So, I mean, it should be on the same level, I think. But on the other hand, I think we do have TCM, we do have Criterion, we do have curators like Marty Scorsese and all sorts of preservationists. So I would assume that there will be people like that will follow us and have this commitment. I just don't think it's ever going to be a huge number of people. It's going to be more, not arcane, but sort of a little more specialized.
Yeah, more niche, right?
Yeah. And I'm just so glad that I lived when I did, so I could be the beneficiary of all the great things that came before me as well as now. But I think even the ones that are hot, series and whatnot that are all anybody talks about, I mean, they've sort of taken over that place that Hollywood narrative film once occupied of stories that people were seeing and talking about. I mean, they're going to become dated as well. We just don't know which ones are going to be more dated than others. And
the content today, a lot of it is so disposable and forgettable, and it's just mass-produced to an extent that there's too much crowding the ether. There's too much choice.
But there are also some very good ones. There's some really terrific series.
It's a golden age
really
for television programming in terms of the streaming channels and cable TV and things like that. So I'm not trying to denigrate.
No, but Hollywood is just given. I mean, I don't think that you can even call them movies that come out of Hollywood now for the most part. So we're relying mostly on independent cinema and other cinemas to give us what Hollywood once did. I mean, this was really, we're looking back on the golden age and never to return. But yeah, I agree with you. I just hope that there are people that are in tune with all of these that will bring them before new audiences. And I think they will, if there is a world at all.
I want to ask you, what is His Girl Friday's greatest gift to viewers? So Cineversary is a program that celebrates a milestone anniversary or birthday, if you will, of a major motion picture. And birthdays are all about getting presents, only I always contend that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts here. So yeah, what is the greatest gift to viewers here?
Well, first of all, I think the screwball comedy of the 30s and 40s is one of the great genres ever, and nothing has ever matched it since then for the excitement and charisma of a man and a woman. I mean, we don't have couple films like that quite anymore. Battling it out with talk as the eros, as the engine. Talk is exciting. I mean, you think of talk, you just think of talking heads or something like that. It's talk as action, talk as sex. And where are you going to get that? Because certainly after the end of the production code, you had sex for sex. And I think there's something, it's a kind of relief sometimes in going back to a time when sex was sort of repressed and it was sublimated into talk. And that's very exciting. And that'll never happen again. So I think anyone who values language and talk and incredible pairings of stars, I mean, that was also a tradition of the time. In The Thin Man and all these movies, you had two stars who clicked, and you would see not necessarily the same stars, but interesting pairings of males and females.
Yes.
And just seeing that in the context of all these others and thinking about these different actors and how they interacted and the sparks they struck. I mean, there's nothing like it, and this is one of the absolute best of the screwball comedies, not to mention newspaper comedies.
Couldn't say it better, and I agree. I mean, besides the impeccable casting, which includes, as we said, the brilliance of using Ralph Bellamy, is yet another comical love interest who loses the girl to Cary Grant. And in addition to the use of so many great character actors, we didn't even talk about it. You got Porter Hall, Gene Lockhart, Roscoe Carnes, Billy Gilbert, Abner Biberman. I mean, there's so many familiar faces here you've seen in other comedies and movies. Besides these things, I think you said it best. The greatest gift is the snappy discourse, the speedy dialogue, the astounding verbal gymnastics that are aced by the actors and the characters they portray. So many films impress with their masterful visuals and compositions. I think His Girl Friday stands out instead for its words and their breakneck tempo and rhythm. To me, it's probably less funny than it is fascinating for its wordplay and the dynamism of its two leads.
Yeah, well said.
Are you currently working on anything that listeners should check out? Anything for Criterion?
Well, no, I don't have. I am working on something, but it's at the early stages, and it's really going to be, I hope, a kind of memoir about movie love in the 60s and 70s, and also a kind of memoir, just a personal memoir, you know, sort of, it's one of these hybrid forms where it's both personal memoir and memoir of a time. And I also want to sort of pay tribute to Andrew, my deceased husband, and sort of what he did and meant for me. So a combination of things, and I'm trying to get it done.
Yeah, the great Andrew Saris, who left behind such a wonderful legacy with his film criticism and his books. Yes, sorely missed, but we'll keep an eye out for that. Is that going to be in book form, I assume?
Well, I hope so, if they're still publishing. I mean, that's sort of gloomy. I'm sort of pessimistic now about whether we'll ever have more books, and everything is a little bit at a standstill now, but that's fine for me because I'm still sort of working away, and it'll be a while before I have anything to show.
I think you'll have an avid audience for something like that, so I'll certainly keep my eye out for it. I hope my audience does as well. But Molly, thank you again so much for agreeing to appear on Cineversary and for the generous use of your time.
Thank you, Eric, and I look forward to hearing all of your podcasts, so I really enjoyed this.
Oh, so fun to talk to a film expert I've long admired. Much gratitude to Molly for appearing on our show, and on very short notice, I might add. Molly, you are the best. That's definitely another bucket list item I can mark off. And that takes us to standing ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, a book, website, a TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. This time around, I'm pointing my compass to a fellow podcast, and what a podcast. It's called Origins, hosted and written by James Andrew Miller, and it offers multi-episode miniseries on different pop culture creations and topics. Previous examples include a 5-episode deep dive into Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm and a 3-part foray into Saturday Night Live. Origins' latest outing is a 6-chapter retrospective celebrating the 20th anniversary of Cameron Crowe's love letter to rock and roll, Almost Famous. The cool thing is that all the important collaborators are included. So you got Cameron Crowe, Kate Hudson, Frances McDormand, Billy Crudup, Zooey Deschanel, Jimmy Fallon, Patrick Fugit, and Jason Lee all participated in this miniseries. It's well worth your time and serves as a nice Cineversary-type counterpart that spotlights yet another film commemorating a milestone anniversary like we do right here. So I encourage you to check it out. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. And that brings us to the end of another installment of Cineversary. Are you eager to learn what's on the agenda for August? We're going to venture back to medieval Japan for one of the highest praised and highest prized works of world cinema, the deeply philosophical, thought-provoking, and timeless Rashomon, helmed by Akira Kurosawa, originally released in August 1950. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, stay safe and healthy through this pandemic, and cherish those classic movies because they're getting better, not older. Thanks again for giving us a listen.